I never thought I'd have to fight for land that was already mine. But when I got the call that morning, everything changed. It was just after sunrise when my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it, thinking it was another spam call. But then I saw the name, Mrs. Thompson, my grandfather's neighbor for over 40 years. I answered, still half asleep. Her voice was shaking. "They're building houses on your property. You need to come quick." I sat up fast. "What do you mean? Who's building?" "The Sunny Pines people," she said. "Big yellow machines showed up yesterday. They're digging up your east fields." That didn't make sense. My grandfather had owned that land his whole life. He'd passed it down to me when he died last year. He would never have sold it, not in a million years. At first, I thought maybe Mrs. Thompson was mistaken. Maybe a construction crew had crossed the property line by accident. But I could hear the anger in her voice, the urgency. And Mrs. Thompson wasn't one to exaggerate. I didn't waste another second. I threw some clothes into a bag, grabbed my keys, and got in my car. 5 hours of highway stretched between me and my grandfather's farm. I drove like I was racing against time, my heart pounding harder with every mile. Something wasn't right, and I was about to find out just how bad it was. The dirt road leading to my grandfather's farmhouse felt different this time. The quiet countryside I remembered was gone, replaced by the deep rumble of heavy machines. As I reached the top of the hill overlooking the eastern fields, my stomach dropped. Bulldozers and excavators crawled over the land like ants, tearing up soil that had grown corn and soybeans for generations. Workers in hard hats moved quickly, marking plots with bright orange paint. Then I saw it, a massive sign planted near the road. "Future home of Sunny Pines East, luxury living, starting at $450,000. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. This wasn't some minor mistake. They weren't just building near my land. They were building on it. I parked near a temporary office trailer and stepped out, my boots sinking into the loose dirt. A woman stood nearby, watching everything like she owned the place. She wore spotless beige pants and a crisp white blouse, her hair styled perfectly, not a trace of dust on her. She held a clipboard in one hand and a phone in the other, barely noticing me until I spoke. "What's happening here?" I asked, my voice sharp. She glanced up, looking me over like I was someone trying to sell her something. Then she gave a polite, practiced smile. "We're preparing for residential development," she said smoothly. "Diane Reynolds, president of the Sunny Pines Homeowners Association." She extended a hand, but there was no warmth in it. I didn't take it. "This is my land." Diane tilted her head, her smile never fading. "No, it's ours. We bought it fair and square." She pulled a folder from her clipboard and flipped it open, holding up a set of official-looking documents. "We have all the necessary permits and approvals." I barely heard her. My grandfather would never have sold this land. Whatever paperwork she had, something was very, very wrong. I left the construction site with my mind racing. Something didn't add up. My grandfather had lived on this farm his entire life. He loved this land. There was no way he would have sold it without telling me. But Diane had paperwork saying otherwise. If there was an answer, it would be in his old office. The farmhouse sat quiet and still, untouched since his passing. It smelled the same: pipe tobacco, aged wood, and the faint scent of old books. I hadn't been able to bring myself to go through his things after the funeral, but now I had no choice. If someone had stolen this land, I needed to prove it. I started with his desk, pulling open drawers and flipping through folders. He kept records of everything: crop yields, rainfall, even repairs on the old tractor. But nothing about selling land. I moved to the filing cabinet, hoping for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. Hours passed. My eyes burned from reading faded documents under the dim light of a desk lamp. Just when I was about to give up, Something caught my eye, a loose floorboard. I pressed my foot against it, and it shifted slightly. My hands moved quickly, prying it up. Beneath it, covered in dust, was a small metal box. My breath caught as I reached for it. The key was taped to the underside of the desk, right where he must have left it. Inside, I found exactly what I needed. First was the original deed to the farm, proving my grandfather still owned it when he died. Then came a stack of old property surveys, the borders carefully marked in his neat handwriting. And finally, a letter. My name was written across the envelope in his shaky but familiar script. If you're reading this, someone is trying to take what's ours. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. In the letter, he explained that developers had been circling the land for years. They had pressured him, threatened him, even offered ridiculous amounts of money. But he never gave in. Then, in his final months, a man from Sunny Pines kept showing up, claiming to need his signature for a road easement. Each time, it was a different document. "I never signed away my land," he wrote. "If they say I did, it's a lie." I looked at the old surveys again. That's when I saw it. The boundary lines didn't match the ones on Diane's paperwork. According to these records, our land stretched much farther than what was listed today, not just the area under construction. They had already built part of Sunny Pines on stolen land. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a trap my grandfather had seen coming. By sunrise, I was sitting in the office of Walter Franklin, the only property lawyer in town. He was older, with thick glasses and a neatly pressed suit that made him look more like a retired professor than a lawyer. His office smelled of old books and coffee, and the walls were lined with shelves stuffed with legal binders. I spread the documents across his desk, my grandfather's original surveys, the current county records, and the so-called sale of the land. Walter examined them closely, tracing the boundary lines with his finger. He didn't say a word for a long time, just flipping between maps and shaking his head. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "This isn't just an error," he said. "This is fraud." He pointed to a document from 20 years ago. A small adjustment in the county records that quietly shaved off 80 acres from my grandfather's land. The official reason? A minor zoning correction. But there was barely any paperwork to support it, just a single form with a signature that looked nothing like my grandfather's. Walter exhaled sharply. "They didn't just steal your land. They changed the records to make sure no one would ever notice." I clenched my jaw. "Can we stop the construction?" Walter nodded. "I'll file for an emergency injunction. If the judge signs off, they have to halt everything immediately." By that afternoon, the order was official. All construction was to stop, effective immediately. I drove straight back to the development site, court papers in hand. Diane was there, standing near a group of workers. The second she saw me, her face hardened. I handed her the papers. "Construction stops now." She snatched them from me, scanning the legal notice. For the first time, she looked uncertain. But it didn't last long. Her usual smirk returned, colder than before. "This little stunt will cost you," she hissed, folding the papers and tucking them under her arm. I met her stare. "Not as much as it's going to cost you." The next morning, I woke up to find a bright orange ticket stuck to my truck's windshield. $500 fine for a parking violation. The problem? My truck was parked in my own driveway. I crumpled the ticket in my fist. This wasn't a mistake. This was a message. An hour later, a white county truck rolled up, and a man in a reflective vest stepped out. Building inspector. He barely glanced at me before starting his routine inspection of my grandfather's farmhouse. After about 10 minutes, he handed me a clipboard filled with violations' unsafe porch railing. outdated electrical wiring, septic system non-compliant. If I didn't fix everything immediately, I could face daily fines or even eviction. I was still standing there, reading through the ridiculous list, when I turned on the kitchen sink, and nothing came out. I checked the bathroom. Same thing. The water was completely shut off. I called the utility company, and after being transferred 5 times, a bored-sounding woman told me there was scheduled maintenance in my area. No warning, no timeline for when it would be fixed. That night, I went to leave for town, only to find my driveway blocked. Someone had placed huge concrete barriers across the entrance. There was no way around them, and no one in town would admit to knowing how they got there. My phone rang. "Diane," I picked up, already expecting the smugness in her voice. "You think you can fight us? I own this town." I took a slow breath, gripping the phone tighter. "You're desperate." "No, I'm realistic," she said smoothly. "And I'm giving you a way out. Sign over the disputed acres, and this all goes away. 7 figures, immediate payment." I laughed, shaking my head. "Not interested." Her voice dropped lower. "Everyone has a price. Think about it. Otherwise, things are only going to get harder for you." I hung up. She thought she could bully me off my own land. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Late that night, just as I was about to turn off the porch light, a car pulled up to the farmhouse. I tensed, half expecting more trouble from Diane. But when the driver stepped out, I was surprised. Gerald Fisher, the HOA treasurer. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder like someone might be watching. He hurried up the steps, gripping a small flash drive in his hand. "I shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "But you need to see this." I let him inside, and he sat at the kitchen table, tapping the flash drive against the wood. "I've been keeping records for years. Diane controls everything. Who gets fined, where the money goes, which companies get contracts." I grabbed my laptop, and we plugged in the drive. What I saw made my stomach turn. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in HOA fees funneled into personal accounts. Diane's, her husband's, even some county officials. Fake fines slapped on homeowners for made-up violations, all to keep the HOA's bank account full. Overpriced construction contracts, all given to companies secretly owned by Diane and her inner circle. They were charging double, sometimes triple, the real cost for work that was either poorly done or never completed at all. I sat back in my chair, exhaling sharply. "She's not just stealing land," I muttered. "She's stealing from every homeowner in Sunny Pines." Gerald nodded. "A lot of us have had enough, but no one's ever been able to prove it, until now." I looked at the screen, scrolling through the endless files of fraud and corruption. That's about to change. The Sunny Pines Community Center was packed. Homeowners filled every chair, chatting excitedly as Diane stood at the front, dressed sharp as ever, her voice smooth and confident. Behind her, a projector displayed shiny images of what was supposed to be the future of Sunny Pines East. New homes, fancy landscaping, even a community pool. "Imagine the value of your homes skyrocketing," she said, smiling. "This development is the future, a luxury neighborhood, built with you in mind." I pushed open the double doors and walked straight down the aisle, heads turned. A few people whispered. Diane's eyes landed on me, and for a brief second, her polished expression cracked. "Before you all get too excited," I said loudly, stepping onto the stage beside her, "let's talk about who really owns this land." Diane's smile returned, tighter this time. "We'll take questions after the presentation." "This isn't a question," I said, pulling a stack of papers from my folder. "It's a fact." I turned to the crowd. "This entire development, every house, every street, every lot, is sitting on land that was stolen from my family. The room fell silent. I held up the first document. This is my grandfather's original land survey, recorded decades ago. And this, I pulled out another, is the altered version, changed illegally 20 years ago to take nearly 80 acres from my family. Murmurs spread through the room. Homeowners exchanged uneasy glances. "That's ridiculous," Diane snapped, grabbing one of the papers. "We have legal ownership. This land was bought and paid for." I nodded. "That's what you told me. But here's what you didn't mention." I placed another document on the podium. The survey proves that not only is this new development on stolen land, but so are at least 20 homes that were built years ago. Gasps. A few people stood up. A man in the back shouted, "Are you saying we don't actually own our houses?" Diane's jaw tightened. "This is nonsense. We have permits, approvals, based on fraud," I interrupted. "And it doesn't stop there. I've seen the HOA's financial records. Every time you were fined for a fence being too tall, for your grass being too long, for painting your house the wrong color, that money didn't go back into the neighborhood. It went into Diane's pocket." Shouts rang out. People turned toward Diane, demanding answers. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced with something else. Panic. And then I dropped the final blow. "Diane, your house," I said, pausing just long enough for the room to go silent again. "It's sitting on my land." She turned pale. Chaos erupted. Some homeowners were furious, demanding refunds and explanations. Others looked genuinely terrified, realizing their homes might not legally belong to them. Diane grabbed her papers, her face red with anger. "This meeting is over," she snapped, storming off the stage. "I'll see you in court," I smiled. "I'll be ready." The fallout was immediate. By the next morning, word had spread. The police, county officials, and even a few state investigators showed up at the Sunny Pines HOA office. They carried stacks of documents, ones I had given them, financial records, fraudulent land transfers, and proof of HOA funds being funneled into Diane's personal accounts. Diane wasn't at the office. She was hiding. Her usual confidence had vanished, and for good reason. One by one, her allies began distancing themselves from her. The county commissioner, who had pushed through Sunny Pines permits, he suddenly claimed he had no idea about the illegal land deal. The judge she bragged about knowing? He quietly recused himself from any cases involving the HOA, and then, the final nail in the coffin, the environmental survey. I hadn't even planned for this. It came from a reporter who had been digging into the development's permits. He sent me a single message. "Check the land records. You'll want to see this." What I found changed everything. The eastern section of my grandfather's land, the same area where Diane had started construction, was protected wetlands. The original zoning changes, the rushed approvals, the secret deals, they had all ignored one crucial fact. Building there was a federal crime. By the end of the week, the entire Sunny Pines East project was dead. No luxury homes, no million-dollar expansion, nothing. And Diane? She didn't just lose her development, she lost everything. The day they arrested her, half the neighborhood stood outside her house, watching. Fraud, embezzlement, illegal land sales, and now violations of federal environmental laws. She tried to walk out with her head high, but her face was pale, her hands shaking as they cuffed her. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Guess she doesn't own the town after all. The community wasn't done yet." At the next HOA meeting, the residents voted to dissolve the entire homeowners association. No more useless fines. No more unfair rules. No more Diane Reynolds. I stood at the back, watching as the vote passed almost unanimously. Homeowners clapped, some even cheering, The same people who had once feared speaking out were now standing up for themselves. It was over. Diane had built an empire on stolen land, lies, and intimidation. And now, it was gone. A year later, the land was finally at peace. No bulldozers, no construction, no HOA threatening to fine people over nonsense rules. The farm was mine again, just like my grandfather wanted. But this wasn't just about taking back what belonged to my family. The people in Sunny Pines had been trapped too, stuck under the weight of Diane's greed. That changed. With the HOA gone, we built something better. A new community organization, run by the homeowners themselves. No hidden fees, no ridiculous fines, just simple, fair rules that actually made sense. As for the wetlands, they were protected for good. Instead of houses, we built a public park. Walking trails, picnic areas, even a small playground. The same land Diane tried to steal was now a space for families to enjoy, and no one had to pay a fine just to plant a tomato in their own yard. That evening, I sat on my grandfather's old porch, a cold glass of lemonade in my hand. Kids rode their bikes down the street, their laughter carrying through the air. A few neighbors waved as they passed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my grandfather's journal. I had found it while cleaning out the farmhouse. He had written about the land, the developers, even his suspicions about what might happen after he was gone. He knew. I flipped to the last page, his handwriting faded but clear. They'll come for what isn't theirs, but greed makes people blind. If they ever try, just remember, the best trap isn't one you set, it's the one your enemy walks into on their own. I smiled, closed the book, and watched the sun set over the land that was finally home again.